France is spending nearly $8 billion to dig a canal most people have never heard of. A 107-kilometer freight corridor cutting through northern France, across farmland, across old World War I battlefields, across one of Europe's oldest infrastructure failures. But this is not really a story about a canal. It is a story about trade routes, about ports losing power, about why one of Europe's biggest economies spent more than 200 years trying and failing to connect itself to the industrial heart of the continent. Because right now, Rotterdam controls the flow of cargo into Europe, Germany controls the inland freight network, and France has spent more than a century stuck outside the system. Now the country is making one final attempt to change that. The question is not whether France can build the canal. The question is whether this becomes Europe's next great trade corridor or one of the most expensive infrastructure mistakes in modern European history. Right now, France is moving more than 55 million cubic meters of earth to build a canal that could completely reshape the flow of trade across Europe. The project stretches more than 100 kilometers through northern France. It cuts across farmland, small industrial towns, and some of the deadliest battlefields from World War I. The price tag is already approaching $8 billion, and the final number could climb even higher before a single cargo ship ever passes through it. French officials call it a missing link in Europe's freight system. Supporters believe it could become the most important logistics corridor France has built in more than a century. But there is one massive problem. France has already tried to solve this exact issue multiple times, and every attempt ended in failure. Napoleon pushed for the same route more than 200 years ago because he understood something modern governments still understand today. Whoever controls inland trade routes controls economic power. Another version of the canal collapsed into chaos during World War I, when the unfinished corridor became part of the German defensive line. Then France tried again in the 20th century, building a canal that was already too small almost the moment it opened. For more than 2 centuries, this corridor has represented one unanswered question at the center of the French economy. How do you connect Atlantic trade directly into the industrial core of Europe? Because this is not really about water, or ships, or engineering. This is about logistics, supply chains, and control over the movement of money across the continent. And right now, France is losing that battle. To understand why France is spending billions on this canal, you first have to understand how cargo moves across Europe today. The center of that system is not Paris. It is Rotterdam. The Dutch port is the largest in Europe, handling hundreds of millions of tons of cargo every year. Antwerp in Belgium comes second. Together, these 2 ports function like the main gateway into the European economy. Containers arrive from Asia. Oil arrives from the Middle East, raw materials arrive from America, and from there, the cargo moves inland through the Rhine River system, one of the most efficient freight corridors on Earth. Massive barges carry up to 4,000 tons of cargo in a single trip. That is the equivalent of hundreds of heavy trucks moving on highways at the same time. Germany built much of its industrial strength around this network. Factories, steel plants, chemical hubs, and logistics centers all grew around waterways that could move huge amounts of freight cheaply and efficiently. The Netherlands perfected the system over decades, turning rivers into economic arteries for the entire continent. On some major routes, more than half of all freight moves by water. But France never fully connected itself to that network, and that created a massive economic weakness hiding in plain sight. France's main Atlantic port, Le Havre, sits in a near-perfect location on the western edge of Europe. Geographically, it should have become one of the continent's dominant freight gateways. But for decades, cargo arriving there faced an immediate bottleneck. The inland canal system connecting northern France to the rest of Europe was designed in 1908, built for ships carrying only a fraction of modern freight volumes. By today's standards, the system was outdated almost before the modern global economy even began. The problem started with a canal that was already too small for the future. The Canal du Nord was built for barges carrying around 650 tons of cargo, a reasonable number in the early 20th century. But modern European barges can now carry nearly 7 times that amount. As global trade expanded and freight systems modernized, France faced a choice. It could rebuild its inland waterways for the new economy, or it could rely on roads instead. Germany expanded water freight. The Netherlands doubled down on river logistics. France built highways, trucks, slowly became the default solution for moving cargo across the country, especially between Paris and the Belgian border. Over time, that route transformed into one of the most congested freight corridors in Europe. Thousands of trucks moved through it every single day, carrying containers that could have traveled by water far more efficiently. But each truck represented something larger than traffic. It represented a logistics system France never fully modernized. And that weakness quietly reshaped European trade patterns for decades. Cargo that could have flowed naturally through French ports often rerouted north instead, toward Rotterdam and Antwerp, where inland access was faster, cheaper, and far more efficient. Rotterdam kept expanding into a logistics giant. Antwerp continued building industrial connections deeper into Europe. Meanwhile, France slowly lost influence inside the continent's freight economy, despite having one of the best geographic positions in Western Europe. By the early 2000s, the problem had become impossible to ignore. The European Union finally approved a massive new canal project designed to reconnect France to the main inland freight system of Europe. But even after approval, almost nothing happened. Construction did not officially begin until 2022, nearly 19 years later. The engineering challenge was enormous, but the political battle surrounding the project turned out to be even harder than digging the canal itself. This is not a normal canal project. What France is building is closer to a complete reconstruction of its inland freight system. The scale is enormous. Engineers are constructing 6 giant locks capable of lifting massive cargo vessels more than 25 meters above different water levels. The largest of these locks will become the biggest ever built in Europe. The project also includes 62 bridges, new industrial freight hubs, and one of the most ambitious structures in modern European infrastructure, a 1,330-meter aqueduct carrying cargo ships directly above an entire river valley. At the center of the route, ships will literally sail through the air, suspended more than 30 meters above the Somme River below, and the costs continue to rise. When the project was first approved, the official budget stood at around 5.1 billion euros. Today, estimates have already climbed beyond 7.3 billion euros, and government auditors warned the real number could move even higher before completion. That increase happened before the canal has transported a single commercial barge. But money is only one part of the challenge. Construction crews are constantly uncovering unexploded bombs buried beneath the landscape from both world wars. In one section alone, workers removed more than 1,200 old munitions over just a few years. Archaeologists now work directly alongside construction teams because the canal cuts through the Somme battlefield, one of the deadliest areas in modern military history. Human remains are still discovered during excavation. Every layer of earth carries traces of war, industry, and political failure stretching back generations. This project is not simply being built through farmland. It is being built through history itself. And despite the rising costs, legal battles, and enormous engineering risks, France kept moving forward because leaders in Paris believe the alternative is even more dangerous: economic irrelevance. The real battle surrounding this canal is not engineering, it is economics. Every container routed through the French port of Le Havre is cargo Rotterdam may never handle. Every shipment moved by barge instead of truck threatens an entire logistics industry built around highways. And every industrial hub constructed along this corridor has the potential to redirect billions of dollars in future investment across Europe. That is why resistance formed almost everywhere around the project. Farmers lost land as the canal route cut directly through agricultural regions. Some properties were divided in half by the construction zone. Environmental groups challenged permits in court, warning about damage to protected wetlands and ecosystems. Government auditors warned the budget could continue rising for years. Critics questioned whether France was trying to solve a 20th century problem inside a completely different economic era. Because Europe itself is changing. Germany's old industrial engine is slowing down. Coal demand collapsed across much of the continent. Steel production weakened. Heavy manufacturing no longer dominates the European economy the way it once did. So opponents began asking a dangerous question. What if this corridor is being built for an economy that no longer exists? But France believes the future of freight is changing again. Officials argue the canal is not designed for coal or old heavy industry. It is designed for the next generation of European supply chains. Green energy infrastructure, agricultural exports, chemical logistics, Container traffic that still depends heavily on trucks because there is no efficient inland water route connecting Atlantic ports into the center of Europe. In other words, this project is not trying to rebuild the old Europe. It is trying to position France inside the next version of it. Because in modern economies, infrastructure does not just move cargo. It determines where money, factories, and political influence go next. But here is the twist that changes the entire story. France is not building this canal to defeat Rotterdam. That battle was already lost decades ago. Rotterdam has more than 50 years of infrastructure advantage, deeper freight networks, larger industrial connections, and one of the most efficient logistics systems ever built in Europe. The port dominates continental trade because entire supply chains were designed around it for generations. France understands this. Politicians understand it. Shipping companies understand it. And investors understand it. So the real goal of this canal is not domination. It is survival. For more than a century, France's main Atlantic port, Le Havre, faced the same structural weakness. Cargo arriving there had only two practical options: move inland by truck or lose freight traffic to ports farther north with better inland access. That limitation quietly shaped investment decisions across Europe for decades. Manufacturers built factories closer to established freight corridors. Logistics firms concentrated around the Rhine system. Ports connected to inland waterways kept expanding, while France struggled to fully integrate into the continent's core trade network. This canal changes that equation for the first time in modern history. It gives France direct large-scale inland access into the industrial center of Europe. And that changes how companies think about future investment. It changes how shipping routes are priced. It changes where warehouses, factories, and freight hubs may eventually be built. Because in modern logistics, access matters as much as geography. A port without inland connectivity slowly loses relevance, no matter how favorable its location looks on a map. That is why this project matters far beyond France itself. This canal is not about building the biggest freight route in Europe. It is about making sure France still has a place inside the future trade map of the continent. And that makes the stakes far larger than a normal construction project. If this project works, France could remove more than 1 million heavy trucks from its roads every single year. New industrial zones could rise along the canal corridor. Logistics hubs could expand deeper into northern France. And for the first time in modern history, Le Havre could operate as a true Atlantic gateway, connected directly to the industrial core of Europe. But there is still one brutal possibility nobody can ignore. The trucking system already exists. The highways are already built. And businesses rarely change supply chains unless the financial advantage is impossible to ignore. That means this canal could open exactly as planned in 2032, with perfect engineering, modern infrastructure, and full political support, and still struggle to pull freight away from the routes companies already use today. And that turns this entire project into something much larger than construction. It becomes a test of whether aging economies can still reinvent themselves before global trade patterns permanently harden around someone else. Because history shows something dangerous about infrastructure. Once money, cargo, and investment begin flowing through a different corridor, entire nations can spend generations trying to redirect it back. And sometimes, they never succeed. Because in the modern economy, the places that control movement eventually control everything else. And sometimes, they never do.